Eyes. The dogs were supposed to tear her apart, they didn't. Eyes. Nurse Mara Sutton arrived at Greywall Tactical Training Center in a faded field jacket and a temporary contractor badge, and within 20 minutes, Colonel Denton Hale had already decided she was a joke. Overweight civilian. A nurse who smelled like antiseptic and had no business standing inside a military K-9 facility. Laughed in front of his men. Then he ordered her into the stress pen with 3 starving guard dogs to prove his point. 60 seconds later, the training ground went completely silent. Hans, the most dangerous dog, a scarred Belgian Malinois named Ghost, lowered his head and stood beside her, like he'd been waiting years for someone who actually understood him. Before we go any further, if this story already has you leaning forward, I want you to subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The morning Mara Sutton drove through the main gate of Greywall Tactical Training Center, she almost missed the entrance. The sign was rust-dyed, at one corner tilted slightly toward the ground, like someone had backed a truck into it and nobody had bothered to fix it since. She slowed her car, checked the address printed on the contractor agreement in the passenger seat, and turned in. The facility sprawled across 11 acres of scrubland in the flat stretch between Dunmore and the military corridor that locals simply called the Strip. Lynx fencing ran the perimeter, topped with concertina wire that caught the early morning light and threw it back in thin silver lines. The buildings were utilitarian concrete, low roof lines, heavy doors, no windows on the ground level. The K-9 unit was housed in the northeastern corner, separated from the main training barracks by a narrow paved road and a row of metal storage sheds. Parked in the visitor lot, which was a generous name for a patch of cracked asphalt with 3 painted lines. She pulled on her field jacket, olive green worn through at one elbow, and clipped her temporary contractor badge to the lapel. Badge said Medical Contractor Temporary Access, and had her photo on it, taken from a state database, and slightly blurry the way all government-issue photos managed to look like they'd been processed through a fog machine. She had 48 hours on site, that was what the contract said. 48 hours to conduct a medical assessment of the K-9 unit's current animals, document any health deficiencies, and submit a preliminary report to the oversight committee that had commissioned the review. She'd done this kind of work 3 times before, twice at civilian kennels and once at a county sheriff's department facility that turned out to have a mold problem behind the intake walls. This, she had told herself on the drive over, was just another facility. Walk in, do the job, walk out. She was wrong about that, but she didn't know it yet. The duty sergeant at the K-9 unit entrance looked at her badge for about 2 seconds before looking up at her face, then back at the badge, then past her shoulder at the visitor lot. He said, "Just me." He had the flat effect of someone who had been manning checkpoints for too long. He wrote her name in a log, handed her a visitor lanyard that was technically redundant given she already had the badge, and pointed her toward a building marked Unit Admin. A woman named Specialist Oakes directed her to wait in a hallway that smelled like industrial cleaner and old rubber. There was a metal bench against the wall. Mara sat on it. Through a door to her left, she could hear 2 male voices, low and unhurried, punctuated by occasional laughter. She waited 11 minutes before the door opened. Colonel Denton Hale was not a tall man, but he carried himself the way some men do when they've spent decades in environments that rewarded size and volume slightly forward at the chest. Chin, elevated just enough to look down at most people, even when the height wasn't there to justify it. He was in his late 50s, close-cropped silver hair, a jaw that still looked like it had opinions about things. He wore his uniform with the precision of someone who ironed it himself, which she suspected was true. Behind him was his second-in-command, a heavy-set man named Captain Brees London, who said nothing and appeared to be there primarily to witness whatever was about to happen. Hale looked at Mara the way people sometimes look at a piece of furniture that's been delivered to the wrong address. "You're the medical assessor," he said. It wasn't a question. It had the tone of a statement being made about a disappointing situation. "Or Sutton." "Yes," he glanced at the badge. "Sutton." "You're a registered nurse. I am not a veterinarian." The oversight committee specified a registered nurse with animal behavioral assessment training. "That's my certification." She didn't say it defensively. She said it the way you'd read a line off an ingredient label, plain, complete, not looking for a debate about it. Hale's expression didn't change. He looked at London, then back at her. "This facility runs 16 active service animals across 2 operational units. These are not house pets. These are military working dogs trained for patrol apprehension, explosive detection, and personnel recovery. We've been running this program for 9 years, I understand that." Do you again, not a question. Mara held the lanyard with both hands. Not fidgeting, just holding it. I'd like to start with the medical intake files, and then do a physical walkthrough of the kennels. If you have a handler available who can accompany me during the animal contact portions, I'll need someone who knows each specific protocol. Hale stared at her for a moment that ran about 3 seconds too long. And something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but a decision. London, he said, give her the tour. The kennels were arranged in 2 long rows inside a climate-controlled building that was at least 10 years past needing an update. The ventilation system hummed with the slightly blurred sound of machinery that had been repaired too many times to still be working efficiently. The concrete floors were clean, she'd give them that, but she noticed immediately that 2 of the water stations at the far end of the row were empty. Low empty. The dogs reacted to her the way they often did to strangers alert, watching a few with low vocalizations that weren't quite barks. She walked slowly, did not make direct eye contact with the animals that were showing tension, let her hands loose and visible at her sides. London narrated in a clipped way that made it clear he was performing a briefing rather than having a conversation. Deployment schedule, exercise rotation. Let him talk and looked at the dogs. One pen held an animal that immediately caught her attention. He was a Belgian Malinois, larger than average for the breed, with a scar that ran from his left ear down toward his jaw. Not recent, maybe 2 years old, healed badly, which meant it hadn't been properly cleaned during the acute phase. Pacing, not the restless pacing of a dog that needed exercise. A tight, repetitive, corner-to-corner pacing that she recognized as a stress response in an animal that had been confined too long without adequate stimulation. That one, she said. London glanced at the pen ghost. Our senior patrol dog, 7 years old. He's been here the longest. That's his current daily exercise schedule, a short pause. He gets yard time in the morning. How long? 45 minutes. She looked at the pen dimensions, the worn track in the concrete, from the pacing, the condition of the dog's coat, which was slightly dull across the hindquarters. Water stations at the far end. Those 2 are empty. It topped off at midday. It's past midday. London said nothing. She pulled out her assessment notebook, spiral-bound, nothing digital, because she had learned that paper was harder to misplace or accidentally delete, and wrote the water station observation down with the time. Nice. That was when Hale appeared at the end of the kennel corridor, flanked by 3 unit handlers, who had apparently been collected and positioned with some deliberate intent. Nice. He had his arms crossed and he was watching her, the way someone watches a clock when they're waiting for something. Sutton, he said. How's the tour educational? She capped her pen. I'm going to need the medical intake files for Ghost and for the 2 animals in pens, 11 and 14. Talking on Ghost indicates an untreated laceration. I want to see what the original documentation says about treatment. If our unit veterinarian handled that, I'm sure he did. I'd still like the files. Slowly, the 3 handlers trailing behind him with the practiced ease of men who had watched their commander do this to other people before. He stopped in front of Ghost pen, pent out any particular warmth, then looked back at Mara. Let me show you something, he said, about how this unit actually works. It took her a moment to understand what he meant. By then, London had already moved to the access gate of the stress pen, a separate enclosure at the back of the building, access through a secondary corridor. She had noticed it on the way in. It was larger than the individual kennels, with higher walls and a reinforced door. It was the kind of space used for controlled aggression training and handler stress testing. This is how we evaluate whether someone understands working dogs, Hale said. On paper in practice. 3 dogs were already inside. She could see them through the observation window, not Ghost, but 3 others, each of them showing elevated tension. Food bowls, she noticed, were empty. I'm not a handler, Mara said. No, Hale agreed. You're a nurse with a certification. He said certification the way some people said participation trophy. So let's see what your certification actually means when you're standing in front of 3 dogs that don't know you. One of the handlers said something, under his breath, and 2 of the others laughed. It was the kind of laugh that meant they had already decided how this was going to go. Mara looked at the pen. She looked at the dogs inside it, looked at Hale. This isn't a safety protocol, she said. Nobody said it was. She could feel them watching Hale. London, the 3 handlers, probably specialists, materialized at the corridor entrance at some point in the last 2 minutes. All of them, waiting for her to refuse or panic or make some kind of complaint that would give them the paperwork to terminate her assessment contract on grounds of being uncooperative. She set her notebook on the shelf beside the access door. The 3 dogs were on her immediately, not attacking, but surrounding, which was the stage just before attacking. Science. Rapid investigation, bodies in motion. One of them was vocalizing low and continuous. The smell inside the pen was the sharp, slightly acrid smell of stressed animals in an enclosed space. Stop moving. She let her hands drop to her sides, not raised, not fists, just open and low. She didn't look at any of the dogs directly. She found a neutral point on the far wall, and she focused on that, and she controlled her breathing the way she had been taught to do. In a context these people had no idea she had ever been in. 7 seconds. The continuous vocalization dropped by about half. 5. She moved her weight to one knee, slow, deliberate, not a drop but a lowering, and she let her right hand extend just slightly, palm turned up. Of the first dog, a short-coated shepherd mix, came forward, stiffened, then pulled back. The second one circled her from behind. The third one, the biggest of the three, a brindle-marked animal with a blunt muzzle and a healing wound above his right eye, stopped moving entirely. He stood about 6 feet from her. He looked at her. She did not look back at him, not directly, but she was aware of him the way you are aware of something very important happening in your peripheral vision. 12 seconds. 20 seconds. The brindle dog walked forward. He stopped about 18 inches from her extended hand. He lowered his nose to it without touching it. Then he raised his head and he walked past her and he stood at her left side. She heard Hale say something on the other side of the door. She couldn't make out the words. The shepherd mix sat down. The circling dog came around front and dropped to its stomach about 4 feet away. Stayed on one knee for another 30 seconds. Then she stood up slowly and walked to the door. And it opened. And she walked out. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of the younger handlers said quietly, "How did she—" "That's enough," Hale said. His voice had changed. Softer, harder. The way things get harder when something has happened that was not supposed to happen. Picked up her notebook. "I'd like those files now," she said. 14. And Ghost's full medical history going back to intake. Looked at her. His jaw was set in a way that had moved past pride and arrived somewhere closer to a decision being made. "You'll get what you're authorized to access," he said. The Oversight Committee's authorization covers full medical records for all animals currently housed at this facility. That's in the contract. I'll have my office review the contract language. She held his gaze for exactly as long as she needed to. "I'll come back for the files in an hour," she said, and she walked back toward the main building. She found the water stations again on her way through. Empty. She photographed them with her phone. 3 images, time-stamped different angles, and wrote the time in her notebook for the second time. Then she kept walking. The administrative office was technically unmanned when she arrived, but the filing cabinets along the back wall were labeled, and the one marked Veterinary Medical was not locked. She had not been told she couldn't access it. She had only been told the contract language was under review, which was a bureaucratic delay, not a denial. She opened the cabinet's file was near the front. She pulled it out and began reading. The intake forms were normal standard tray working dog processing documentation, weight and vaccination records, behavioral assessment scores. But about halfway through the stack, something changed. Handwriting changed. Not dramatically, but enough that she noticed small shifts in letter formation, a different pen pressure. Someone had been writing summary notes on Ghost's behavioral assessments for the past 14 months, and those notes were not in the same handwriting as the original handler reports they were supposedly summarizing. She photographed every page. Then she found the notation she wasn't looking for, which was the kind of find that usually meant something. It was a single line in a quarterly review dated 8 months ago, animal exhibiting lateral aggression responses post-conditioning cycle. Recommendation: increase exposure duration. Veterinary note: no physical intervention required at this time. She read it twice post-conditioning cycle. She turned back to the behavioral assessment scores. When she laid them out in order, intake 6 months, 12 months, 14 months, Ghost stress indicators had not decreased over time, which was the normal trajectory for a well-adjusted working dog receiving good handling. Had increased steadily in a pattern that was consistent with repeated aversive conditioning, the kind that produced compliance through pain rather than partnership. She put everything back in the order she'd found it and closed the cabinet. She stood in the empty office for a moment. Then she went to find Ghost's pen. He was still pacing when she got there, but he paused when she appeared at the kennel door. His ears came forward. She crouched at the door and looked not at him, but at the mesh between them, and she waited. He crossed the pen in about 4 seconds. He pressed his nose to the mesh at her eye level and held it there. She looked at the scarring along his jaw up close. It was worse than she'd thought from a distance. The tissue had healed with the kind of irregular contraction that meant there had been repeated irritation during recovery. Either the original wound had reopened more than once, or there had been secondary trauma to the site. Who did this to you? She said, not a question, really. Just a thing you say out loud when the answer is already starting to be obvious. Asked. Made a low sound, not a growl, something different. Athens. Something that might have been an answer. She was still crouched at his pen when she heard Hale's voice behind her. You need to step away from that animal. She stood and turned around. Atkins. Hale was there and London was there, and there was a third person. She hadn't met a civilian in press slacks and a facility ID badge that identified him as director of operations, though she hadn't been given a name yet. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, clean-shaven, with the careful posture of someone who had learned how to look calm, regardless of what was actually happening. Files in the medical cabinet. She said Ghost's behavioral assessments. Handwriting changes in the summary notes. Someone altered those documents. Director of Operations said, those documents are internal unit records. They're not part of your authorized review scope. Contract. The contract has been reviewed, Hale said, at my legal office. 14 minutes ago, she looked at him. That was fast. We have a thorough legal office. He gestured toward the corridor that led to the main entrance. The scope of your assessment has been narrowed to surface health observations, only no file access, no behavioral documentation review. If you'd like to continue under those revised terms, you may. Specialist Oakes will process your departure paperwork. Director of Operations was watching her with an expression. She couldn't quite categorize, not hostile exactly, but careful. The way someone looks when they're watching a situation they're not sure is completely under control. What's your name? She asked him. Directly a beat. Hartwell. Director Elliot Hartwell, Director Hartwell. Those summary notes are written in a different hand than the original handler reports. That's not an access scope issue. That's a documentation integrity issue. That's something the Oversight Committee needs to know, regardless of whether I'm the one who found it. Hartwell said nothing. Hale said Sutton, this way. They walked her out through the main corridor. Specialist. Oakes appeared with a clipboard and a sheaf of paperwork that had been prepared. She noticed not printed on the spot, which meant this had been anticipated before her conversation with Hale concluded, and she was asked to sign an acknowledgement that her site access was being terminated due to scope renegotiation. Signed it. She kept her copy. She was in the visitor lot. Back it on. Mic in hand. When she heard it. The sound was unmistakable even from across the facility. Not a bark, but an alarm bark. Multiple dogs. And underneath it a different sound, shouting, rising fast. She turned back toward the facility. Through the chain link along the eastern perimeter, she could see movement a group of teenagers, 10 or 12 of them, in what appeared to be a youth observer program based on the matching orange vest-style lanyards. They were clustered against the fence of a secondary training yard, and in the training yard Ghost was loose. Not loose the way a dog gets loose when a latch fails. She could see the gate of his kennel building swinging, and she could see the section of perimeter fence that separated the kennel area from the training yard. The section was down, not damaged, unlatched. Someone had opened it. Ghost was not attacking anyone. He was in the center of the training yard, spinning disoriented, his aggression signals running at maximum hackles, weight forward, the tight circular motion of an animal that has been frightened into a defensive posture with nowhere to go. The teenagers were screaming. Some of them were trying to climb the opposite fence. Adults and observer. Lanyards were trying to get them to move away and failing. From inside the facility, she heard Hale's voice over a radio apprehension protocol. Authorized. Take the animal down. She was already moving. She went through the visitor's entrance, past Specialist Oakes, who said her name twice, and then stopped saying it through the corridor and out into the training yard, through the service access she had memorized on the walkthrough. London's voice, hard and sharp, stop. That is an authorized takedown order. She ignored him. She walked into the training yard and she put herself between Ghost and the teenagers. To face her. She stopped moving. She dropped her eyes. Her hands fall open at her sides. Hey, she said. What's that? Quiet. Ghost was vibrating with stress. She could see it across his whole body. The trembling that came from a nervous system running at its red line. His eyes were wild and surface bright, the way animals get when they have been pushed far past the point where they can make good decisions. She took one step forward, not toward him, just a step, repositioning slightly, so her body angle changed and became less of a direct confrontation shape. Stopped spinning. One of the handlers appeared at the service access gate behind her with a catch pole. She heard him, didn't look back. Don't, she said. I have orders. If you come in here with that pole right now, this dog is going to move toward the teenagers. Do you understand me? Don't come in. Silence from behind her. Doc was watching her. His hackles were still up, but his spinning had stopped, and that was the first real progress indicator. She took another small step, still not toward him, just changing her angle, offering him a path away from the group of teenagers without making it feel like she was hurting him. You've been having a terrible day, she said to him in the same quiet register. No, I've been having one too. We're going to get out of this together. Took one step toward her, then another. He was shaking when he reached her, and when he pressed his head against her leg, she put her hand on his neck slowly and held it there without gripping. Behind her, she heard the teenagers being moved. She heard London saying something into a radio. She heard footsteps, multiple sets coming into the training yard. She kept her hand on Ghost's neck and waited. When she finally turned around, there were 6 people in the training yard. London, 2 handlers, Hartwell, and 2 individuals. She had not seen before a man and a woman in civilian clothes with federal contractor lanyards, carrying tablet computers and moving with the specific efficiency of people who had just gotten somewhere and were trying to reconstruct what had already happened. She recognized the lanyard color. She had seen it before. Military oversight. Not local command above local command. She looked at Hartwell. His careful expression was gone. In its place was something she couldn't fully read, but it had the quality of a man who had just watched a plan fail in a way he hadn't accounted for. You took down the perimeter section, she said to him. He said nothing. Ghost's kennel gate, the fence, both of them were unlatched, not damaged. Let him out. And there just happened to be a youth observer group in the training yard at the time. She looked at the 2 federal oversight contractors, who were now photographing the gates and the fence section. And someone just happened to call for oversight presence today. London said, You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, she agreed, not yet. But the federal contractors were there, and Ghost was standing beside her, and the surveillance cameras that she had noticed on her initial walkthrough were mounted at angles that covered both the kennel exit and the perimeter fence, and none of them had been pointed away or covered. Whatever had been meant to happen today, whatever the plan had been, when Hale looked at her in that administrative corridor and decided she was nothing, it hadn't happened the way it was supposed to. And somewhere behind Hartwell's careful face, behind Hale's rigid posture, behind London's radio astic, something had shifted that was not going to shift back. Pressed against her leg. She kept her hand on his neck. She didn't move. She didn't move. That was the part none of them seemed to know how to process. London. Not the 2 handlers standing at the service gate. Not Hartwell with his careful face that stopped being careful about 3 minutes ago. They were all waiting for her to do something, explain herself, back down, make some kind of apologetic noise about having ignored a direct order, and she just stood there with her hand on Ghost's neck and let them wait. The 2 federal oversight contractors were still working the perimeter, photographing the unlatched kennel gate and the section of fence that connected the kennel corridor to the training yard. One of them, the woman, short and precise in her movements, had produced a small evidence kit and was bagging the latch hardware from the fence section. The other one, a tall man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, was pulling footage from the nearest surveillance terminal on his tablet. Ara watched them work. She had not spoken since her last sentence to London, and she was not going to speak again until someone with actual authority addressed her. It took 4 minutes. The woman from oversight looked up from the latch hardware and said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone in the yard to hear, this latch was manually disengaged. There's no mechanical failure, Hartwell said. We'll need to review that conclusion before any Dr. Hartwell. The woman's voice didn't change pitch, but something in it closed a door. Latch is a spring-loaded security clasp. It doesn't disengage by itself. It also doesn't disengage when a dog pushes against it from the inside. Someone opened it from the outside. She looked at him. We'll need the access log for this building for the last 6 hours. The training yard went quiet enough that Mara could hear Ghost breathing. Well, looked at Hale. Hale looked at London. London looked at a point about 18 inches above the oversight contractor's head and said nothing at all. I'll also need, the woman continued, pulling a card from her jacket and holding it toward Mara without making it a dramatic gesture. Just a practical one, a statement from you. When you're ready, Mara took the card. Special Investigator Renata Solis, Department of Defense Internal Oversight, Office of Program Integrity. Pocket. I'm ready now, Mara said. They gave her a room, the administrative office, where the filing cabinets were a different one, smaller at the back of the unit command building, with a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out over the scrubland south of the facility perimeter. Investigator Solis came in with a recorder, set it on the table, and asked Mara to start from the moment she arrived. Talked for 40 minutes. She was precise about times. She was precise about what she had seen in the kennel, what the behavioral assessment records showed, what the handwriting discrepancy looked like, what the water stations looked like, what the stress pen situation was. She described Hale's demeanor, the nature of the order he'd given, the specific words used. She described the moment she'd noticed Ghost loose in the training yard, and exactly what she'd observed about the state of the fence and the kennel gate. Asked questions that were specific and clean. She didn't ask questions that suggested answers, and she didn't ask questions that were designed to produce reassurance. She asked questions like, when you say the handwriting changed, did it change in any consistent direction? And at the moment you entered the training yard, was the fence section already down? Or did you observe it come down? How many people saw you sign the access termination paperwork, and at what time? At the end of 40 minutes, Solis turned off the recorder and said, you took a photograph of the water stations. 2 separate times timestamped. I'll need copies. I'll send them now. Mara pulled out her phone, and Solis gave her a secure file transfer address, and she sent all 17 photographs she'd taken during the day, labeled by location and time. Looked at the incoming files on her own device, then looked up. You said the behavioral assessment records showed a pattern consistent with aversive conditioning. That's a specific claim. What's your background that supports that read? It was a fair question. Mara had been waiting for someone to ask it all day. I spent 6 years as a combat medic. 2 of those years were embedded with a K-9 unit in a theater deployment. I worked under 2 different certified handlers, assisted with veterinary triage in the field, and conducted behavioral assessments on animals that had been through extended high-stress operational cycles. She paused. I know what a dog looks like when it trusts its handler. I know what it looks like when it doesn't. Ghost doesn't trust anyone in this facility. Sus wrote something. She didn't react visibly to the military service disclosure, which told Mara that Solis had already read whatever file existed on her before walking into this room. Thank you, Solis said. Don't leave the area tonight. We may need you in the morning. The motel was 3 miles from the facility entrance, a low building called the Dunmore Rest that had probably been renovated sometime in the early 2000s and hadn't been touched since. The room smelled like recycled air and carpet cleaner, and the heater made a clicking noise every 7 minutes that she eventually stopped noticing. She sat on the edge of the bed with her notebook open and went through everything she'd written, checking for gaps in her own documentation. She added 2 items she'd remembered during the statement that she hadn't written down in the moment: the sound the ventilation system made in the kennel, building the labor, the cycling. The fact that it cut out briefly twice during her walkthrough, which meant the temperature in the kennel was not consistent, which was a welfare issue in its own right, and the fact that one of the handlers, when Hale had first brought the group into the kennel corridor, had glanced at Ghost's pen with an expression that was not the flat professional affect of a handler managing a working animal. As it had been something closer to relief or guilt, the expression of a person who was glad someone else was in the room. She wrote that down. She couldn't prove what an expression meant, but she wrote it down because her job was to document what she saw, and her notebook was hers and nobody had taken it. At some point after midnight, her phone showed a message from a number she didn't recognize. She stared at it. You should have taken the paperwork and left. This isn't what you think it is. Leave Dunmore tonight. She photographed the message, screenshot captured, and forwarded it to Solis's secure transfer address with a timestamp note. Then she put her phone face down on the bedside table, set her alarm for 6, and lay down in her jacket because the room was cold and she didn't trust the heater. She didn't sleep much, but she stayed. 7. The next morning, the Greywall facility had 3 additional federal vehicles in the visitor lot. Could see them from the road. As she drove past on her way to the coffee place, she'd spotted the evening before a gas station with an attached diner that served actual eggs and had the specific energy of a place where truckers and contractors. Without pretension, which made it the best option in a 3-mile radius. She ordered coffee and eggs and sat in a corner booth and read through her notes again while she ate. She was on her 2nd cup when London walked in. He looked like he had not slept. His uniform was correct, but his face had the gray, compressed quality of a man who had been sitting in small rooms having difficult conversations since at least the previous evening. Coffins. He saw her immediately. There weren't that many people in the diner, and he walked over without any apparent hesitation and sat down across from her. She looked at him and waited. "You should know," he said, keeping his voice below the ambient noise of the diner, "that what happened yesterday was not authorized by me. Pen. Or Ghost." He pressed his hands flat on the table. I had no part in what happened with the fence. I want that to be clear. And tell Investigator Solis that I have. He looked at his hands. I'm telling you because you're the one who walked into that yard. And because he started again. Because there are animals in this facility that are in worse condition than what you saw yesterday. There are records that don't match reality. There's a building on the south end of the property that's not in any official documentation. She kept her face. "Still tell me about the building." "I can't." He said it with the frustrated flatness of a man who had made a decision about how far he was willing to go and was not happy about where that line sat. "I can tell you. It's there. I can tell you it's been there for at least 4 years. I can tell you I've been ordered to stay away from it." Lines. He shook his head. "Beyond that, you're protecting yourself." "On that. I have a family," he said it without self-pity. "Just as a fact, and I've already done more than I thought I was capable of doing." He stood up. He left a $5 bill on the table, even though he hadn't ordered anything. A handler. "You want to talk to is Corporal Day," he said. "She's been here 3 years. She requested a transfer 6 months ago. They denied it." He paused. "She's the one who called oversight." Walked out. Mara sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote Corporal Day requested transfer denied, called oversight in her notebook and closed it. Investigator. Solis brought her back onto the facility under a formal witness provision at 9:15, which meant her access was no longer a contractor authorization, but a federal process. Hale met them at the entrance and did not look at Mara at all, which was a notable change from the studied contempt of the previous day. He spoke exclusively to Solis in the clipped language of a commander who had been told by legal counsel exactly what he could and could not say. Was not particularly interested in what Hale could say. She was interested in the access logs for the kennel building, which she'd apparently already requested and received, and in a specific section of those logs that covered the 3-hour window before Ghost had ended up in the training yard. Stayed close without making herself the center of attention. She was good at that. She had learned it in a different context, in conditions these people had no frame of reference for, and she used it now without announcing it. She found Corporal Day at the Eastern Kennel Building, running a routine check on 2 dogs that were scheduled for exercise rotation. Was 26 or 27, a small, precise woman with close-cropped hair, and the deliberate movements of someone who had learned not to make sudden gestures around anxious animals. She looked at Mara when she approached, looked at the federal witness lanyard, and looked back at the dog she was checking without breaking her routine. "Day," I said. "Yes, I saw what you did in the yard yesterday." She ran her hands along the dog's hindquarters, feeling for something muscle tightness probably. Dog. A shepherd named Oren leaned into her touch with the ease of an animal that trusted its handler. This was a different dynamic than anything Mara had seen in Ghost's behavior yesterday, and the contrast was stark. I've been here 3 years, Day continued, and I've never seen anyone walk into a yard with a 12-code animal and come out with both of them calm. Isn't a 12-code animal, Mara said. He's a traumatized one. I glanced at her sideways. Same thing according to their paperwork. That's the problem with their paperwork. Day finished her check on Oren, straightened, and looked at Mara directly for the first time. Her eyes were steady, with the particular steadiness of someone who had decided to stop being afraid of something and was now in that odd cleared space on the other side of the decision. Building, Day said quietly. Do you know about it? I know it exists. It's officially classified as a decommissioned equipment storage facility. It's been on a maintenance hold for 2 years, which means no scheduled inspections, no routine access logs. Is a biometric. Only 2 people on this installation have access. She looked at the kennel door behind Mara, checking. Well, and a man named Greaves, civilian contractor. He comes on site every 3 weeks. He drives a gray panel van with private plates, and he leaves with the van fuller than it arrived. Mara kept her voice flat. What's in the van? Day swallowed. Dogs, she said. Animals that are supposed to be retired. Supposed to be meaning the paperwork says they've been transferred to approved adoption programs. The dogs I've seen loaded into that van, she stopped. Arn's predecessor was a dog named Rex. 8 years of service, decorated twice, supposed to be placed with a family in Ellsworth County. I saw Rex loaded into that van 14 months ago. There's no adoption record. There's no transfer record at all. I looked. The kennel building was quiet around them. Ian stood patiently between them, a dog who had no idea what the humans around him were talking about. That's what I sent to oversight, Day said. Not just Ghost, not just the conditioning records. Rex, the van, the building. Greaves. She looked at Mara, and then they denied my transfer request and reassigned me to night rotations for 2 months. Documented the van photographs. Dates a partial plate number, she exhaled. I have them on a drive that is not on this installation. Ice needs that drive, I know. Day looked at Oren and ran her hand once more along his back, a gesture that had the quality of reassurance directed at herself as much as at the dog. I was waiting to see if anyone was actually going to show up who could do something with it. Right, because I had already sent one report and watched nothing happen. Something is happening now, Mara said. Day nodded. It was a small nod without any confidence that things were going to be easy. Right, just an acknowledgement that the axis had shifted. Ice moved fast when she had the information. Right. That was the thing about federal investigators, that people sometimes underestimated. The process looked slow from the outside because a lot of it happened in rooms you weren't in, but when they had what they needed, the pace changed. At 11 that morning, 2 additional investigators from Solce's team were on site. By noon, they had a warrant. By 12:30, they were at the South Building. Aya was not permitted inside. She stood at the perimeter of the restricted zone they'd established around the building and waited. And the waiting was the hardest part of the day. Not because she didn't trust Solace to do her job, but because she had a specific set of suspicions about what was behind that door, and being right about them was not something she was looking forward to. She was right about them. The first indication was the sound she heard dogs before anyone came out of the building. Not aggressive sounds, not alarm barking. Sounds that were worse than that. The kind of low, exhausted vocalization that comes from animals that have been making noise for a long time without response and have mostly given up on the idea that noise produces results. The second indication was Solace's face when she emerged from the building 40 minutes later. Ice had a controlled face. It slipped briefly when she stepped into the light, and what was underneath the control was not what Mara would have called anger. It was something colder. How many? Mara said. 11 animals, Soli said. 11 are in condition that requires immediate veterinary intervention. 8. The facility has no food supply on site. Water access is from a single automated line that appears to have been malfunctioning. She stopped, uttered again. There are cages that are sized below minimum welfare standards. 9. Some of the animals have restraint injuries. Mara didn't say anything. There are also records in that building, Solis continued. Documents. What looks like a transaction ledger. Her voice stayed even with visible effort. This is not a storage situation. This is a commercial operation. I was escorted from the command building at 1:47 in the afternoon. Saw it from the administration courtyard, where she'd been waiting for Solis to return with the next steps of her witness obligation. 2 of Solis's investigators flanked him, not with cuffs not yet, but with the specific physical proximity that communicated that the decision about cuffs was not Hale's to make. Walked past her, at a distance of about 12 feet. He didn't look at her. He was looking at the ground with the locked, rigid expression of a man who was reorganizing his reality around a new set of facts and had not yet found a configuration that worked. Otwell was already gone. She'd been told that, not shown it. He'd been escorted off-site during the warrant execution, before she'd seen it happen. Buffers. She wondered briefly if the anonymous message on her phone the previous night had come from him. Buffers. The phrasing, "this isn't what you think it is," had the quality of something a person says when they want to believe their own explanation is more complex than the one everyone else is arriving at. She was standing near the kennel building, close enough that she could hear the sounds from inside. Normal sounds. The sounds of animals that had been fed and watered and were making the mild complaints and interactions of dogs, who had enough energy for mild complaints when the door to the unit admin building opened and someone came out who she had not seen before. He was civilian, mid-40s. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone who was very good at not looking like what he actually was, and what he actually was, based on the pace of his walk and the angle of his attention. Someone who had been in the building on purpose and was now leaving on purpose and had calculated exactly how much unhurried speed was required. He had a lanyard, but the lanyard was wrong. It was a facility visitor pass, the same orange strap type she'd been given on arrival. The visitor log, she'd seen it, she'd signed it herself, had only 2 names on it when she'd looked at the previous day's sheet. Off her name, and a maintenance contractor who'd come in before 8. Kids. She looked at him. He didn't look at her. He walked toward the north vehicle lot, not the visitor lot, and his pace was controlled, and even completely inconsistent with the energy of the installation right now, which was the high alert investigators and vehicle care energy of an active federal action, an energy that made most people either hurry toward what was happening or hurry away from it. Right. This man was doing neither. He was moving at the exact pace of someone who did not want his pace to be notable. 5. She pulled out her phone and took 3 photographs, the way she'd taken photographs of the water stations, clear, time-stamped, different angles. He was turned slightly away in 2 of them. The third caught his profile. She forwarded all 3 to Solis immediately with a note: North Vehicle Lot, civilian, wrong lanyard type, wrong behavioral energy for this environment. Know his name. Then she watched where he went. He went to a gray panel van with private plates parked at the far end of the North Vehicle Lot. She stopped walking. She was aware with a clarity that arrived all at once that she was standing 50 yards from the man Day had described, Greaves, the private contractor, who came every 3 weeks and left with a fuller van, and that his timing on a day when federal investigators were executing a warrant on his operation was either a remarkable coincidence or evidence that someone had warned. Late enough that he'd already been on site when the situation changed. She did not approach him. She was a civilian witness under a federal provision, not law enforcement, and she had enough presence of mind to know that the difference between useful and dangerous in this moment was staying on the right side of that line. But she photographed the plate and she called Solis. Picked up on the second ring. Mara gave her the location and the plate number in 15 words and hung up. Watched the van. The van didn't move Greaves. If that was Greaves, stayed in the driver's seat, and in the 2 minutes that followed, she saw him look once in the rearview mirror, once toward the main building, and once directly at her. She held his gaze. He looked away first. Then 3 things happened in rapid sequence. An investigator appeared from the facility's east entrance, moving at a pace that was not quite running but faster than a walk. A second federal vehicle that had been parked near the command building started its engine, and the gray panel van's brake lights came on. Stepped back out of the vehicle lot to the edge of the road, and reversed. The federal vehicle moved to intercept. What followed was not a chase. It was the arrest of a man who had calculated his exit window wrong by about 90 seconds, executed in a parking lot next to a military training facility on a cold afternoon, while 11 dogs were covered in a building. They had been kept in for reasons that a ledger in Solis's evidence bags was trying to explain in considerable and damning detail. Greaves was in cuffs before the van made it to the exit gate. Ada stood at the edge of the lot and watched them walk him past. He was a man of ordinary appearance, the kind of face you'd forget in a grocery store, the kind of bearing that was designed to be unremarkable. When they walked him by, he looked at the ground. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the next several months of legal proceedings weren't going to say more effectively. It was late in the afternoon when Solis found her in the kennel building, where Mara had been given permission to sit with Ghost, while the veterinary team the investigators had called in worked through their assessments of the facility animals. Ghost was in a temporary holding pen that was larger than his previous kennel, and he was lying down for the first time she'd seen, his head on his front paws, watching her with the particular quality of attention that belongs to dogs who have decided on insufficient evidence but with great conviction that a specific human is someone worth tracking. A contract authorization is going to be extended, Solis said, crouching beside the pen opposite Mara. We need your behavioral observations on record as we process the animals. You're the most qualified person on site for that, and you were here before the situation changed. Your baseline observations matter. I know. Mara said, there's also something else. Solis was quiet for a moment. When we pulled the documentation from the South building, there was a personnel file in there. Not an animal record, a personnel file. She looked at Mara steadily. It has your name on it. Ghost lifted his head slightly. Not a current file, Solis clarified. It's old military service documentation, your deployment record, your K9 unit assignment, a field incident report from she checked something on her tablet from a classified mountain operation. The report has an annotation on the cover page. The annotation has 2 signatures, whose Solis turned the tablet to face her. The first signature was Hartwell's. She recognized it from the facility paperwork she'd handled the previous day. One. She did not recognize by signature, but she recognized the name printed beneath it. It was a name she had not heard in 7 years. A name connected to a decision made at altitude and cold in the dark, with a dog who had stopped at a position that every other team member had been ordered to walk through, stopped, refused, been recorded in an incident report as disobedient and unreliable. A report that had cost Mara her continued assignment and sent her back stateside with a commendation she'd never understood, and a discharge classification that had never fully made sense. She looked at the name under the second signature for a long time. Then she said, "He's connected to this facility. He has been Sola said for the last 9 years." Ost pressed his nose against the mesh of the temporary pen. Mara didn't reach for him yet. She was holding very still the way she'd held still in the stress pen the day before, and for the same reason, because some moments required that you let what was in front of you come to you, instead of reaching for it. And because the thing in front of her right now was large enough and dangerous enough, and long enough delayed that moving toward it too fast would be exactly the wrong choice. "What's his name?" she said, even though she could read it on the screen. I said it anyway. "Director Warren Sable, former intelligence. Currently serving as a senior oversight consultant for military K-9 procurement contracts." She paused. "And the person who signed off on the incident report that ended your forward deployment." The kennel building was quiet somewhere outside. The federal vehicle was still in the lot. Greaves was in custody. Hale was in a room somewhere having a conversation with people who had better documentation than he did. And a name Mara had carried for 7 years, without understanding its full weight, had just appeared in an evidence file in a facility she'd walked into 48 hours ago on a routine medical review contract. She looked at Solis. "I'm going to need to see everything in that file," she said. I'm going to need to see everything in that file," she said. Didn't hesitate. She handed over the tablet. The file was 43 pages. Mara read it the way she read everything that mattered, without rushing, without skimming, starting at the beginning and moving forward in sequence, because the sequence was where the truth lived, in the summary at the top, that someone had written to make the conclusion look inevitable. First, 12 pages were her own service record. She'd seen versions of this before the sanitized copy she'd been given at discharge, the one with the classified portions redacted into long black bars that told you something existed without telling you what it was. This version had fewer black bars, not none but fewer, and the ones that remained were in different places than she remembered, which meant what had been considered sensitive had shifted at some point between her discharge and now. Page 13 was the incident report. She had read this document before a version of it, the version she'd been shown during her discharge processing. I had a version that described a K-9 unit field operation in elevated terrain in which the assigned animal had failed to comply with handler direction during a critical movement phase. She had argued at the time that the dog hadn't failed. She had argued that Rook, his name had been Rook, a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois. She'd handled for 11 months and knew the way you know the particular grammar of a person you've spent serious time with had stopped, because there was a reason to stop, and that the reason had been confirmed approximately 40 seconds later, when a secondary pressure plate assembly had been identified directly in the path of the unit's movement. She had made that argument to a review board of 3 men, one of whom had Hartwell's signature on the bottom of the document she was now reading. The board had found that the handler's failure to enforce compliance had created unnecessary risk and delay. The board had found that the animal's behavioral pattern was inconsistent with reliable operational deployment. The board had recommended that both the handler and the animal be removed from forward assignment. She had read those findings 7 years ago and had held them in her chest like a stone. Since then, the specific weight of a conclusion that was factually wrong, officially documented, and apparently permanent. She turned to page 14. It was a memo internal dated 5 weeks after the incident report. It was addressed from Warren Sable to a recipient whose name was partially redacted, and it discussed in the bureaucratic language of operational review the importance of maintaining consistent behavioral standards across K-9 units to ensure procurement contract integrity. It mentioned without naming her that a specific handler had demonstrated a pattern of noncompliance with directive protocols. It recommended that the incident report findings be used as the basis for reclassifying the animal's service record to reflect behavioral unreliability. It was in clear and simple terms a memo directing someone to rewrite what had happened so that the dog's correct instinct looked like a malfunction. She turned another page. There was a photograph, actual photographic paper, not digital, which meant it had been printed from something and placed in this file deliberately. It showed a section of elevated terrain, scrubland, and loose rock with 2 small flags marking positions on a path. Positions mapped exactly to where she remembered the unit being positioned and where Rook had stopped. The photograph had a date stamp. Beneath the photograph in handwriting she didn't recognize, but that was precise and clearly professional, A surveyor's hand or an explosive ordnance technician's were 2 lines of text. Secondary device confirmed at grid reference 47. Positive identification via ground disturbance pattern. Device intact at time of photography. The photograph was dated 2 days after the incident report. Someone had gone back. Someone had documented that the device was real, that Rook had been right, that the board's finding had been made with full awareness of what the ground evidence showed. And that documentation had been placed in a file that was currently sitting in a military training facility connected to a commercial trafficking operation and signed off on by the man who had written the memo recommending they alter the record. She set the tablet down on the concrete beside Ghost's temporary pen. Her hands were steady. She noticed that her hands were steady, and she wasn't sure what it meant, whether it was the training or the particular quality of arriving somewhere. You've been trying to reach for long enough that the arrival feels less like relief and more like the completion of a mechanical process. He put this here, she said. Solis, who had been standing quietly, said it looks that way. Why would he keep documentation that proves he falsified the report? And Solis was quiet for a moment. Because he's been using it for 9 years. Not to prove anything. As a record of what he knows. He can verify if he needs to, she paused. The ledger in the South Building has transactions going back to the facility's 3rd year of operation. Apple's name appears as a contracting authority on 8 of them. If this file is what I think it is, it's his insurance documentation of enough wrongdoing by enough people that if anyone came after him, he had leverage to distribute in multiple directions. Sutton's file, Mara said, or a control file. Yes. Ghost shifted in his pen, stood briefly, then lay back down in a slightly different position, his shoulder now pressed against the mesh nearest to where Mara was sitting. She looked at him and then back at the tablet. He's connected to the trafficking operation, she said. Authorized. The contracts that made it possible. That rises to criminal conspiracy rather than negligent oversight is something the investigators in the South Building are currently working on. Solis's voice was careful. But the file being here under his signature changes the framing significantly. Does he know you have it? Probably within the next 2 hours, Solis said. He's not on site. He'll be notified through official channels when the warrant scope reaches his contracting records, which it will. We have a secondary warrant in process 2 hours. Mara thought about what 2 hours meant for a man who had spent 9 years maintaining leverage through documentation. A man who had kept a deadman's file would have contingencies, would have exit strategies, would have already thought about what happened if someone who understood what the file contained ever sat down and read it. You need to move faster than 2 hours, she said. Fine. No, Solis said, I'm working on it. The veterinary team. The investigators had brought in, finished their initial assessments of the 11 South Building animals by 4 in the afternoon. Aya worked alongside them, not leading. That wasn't her role, but providing behavioral context that the emergency veterinarians, who were skilled with animal physiology and had almost no experience with military working dogs, specifically found genuinely useful. The difference between a dog that was shutting down from illness and a dog that was shutting down from chronic psychological stress looked similar from a purely physical diagnostic standpoint. Mara could read the behavioral layers that the blood panels and physical exams couldn't capture. 3 of the 11 animals were in serious physical condition and were transported to an emergency veterinary facility in Dunmore proper. Of the remaining 8, 2 had injuries consistent with restraint trauma ligature marks on the forelegs in positions and patterns that didn't match standard operational equipment. A veterinarian documenting those findings, a woman named Dr. Asha Oman, who had driven in from the county animal health office and was still wearing her civilian winter coat over her scrubs, looked at Mara when she found the second set of marks and said, simply, this is not a training injury. No, Mara said. It's not been photographed everything. Her documentation was thorough in the way that civilian veterinary documentation often was more thorough than military record-keeping, in her experience, because civilian practitioners hadn't learned to truncate their notes in the direction of operational efficiency. Every finding got its own notation, its own measurement, its own photographic reference. They were finishing the assessment of the 7th animal when Solis appeared at the South Building door and gestured once toward Mara. Outside, the temperature had dropped with the sun. Mara's breath showed. Solis walked her away from the building and toward the administration courtyard, and she moved with the specific directional energy of someone who had received information in the last 20 minutes that had changed the shape of what was happening. It's been contacted, Solis said. Not by us. By someone on this installation. Who we don't know yet. His phone records show an outgoing call from a facility number at 342, identifying the line. She stopped walking. He's filed a preemptive legal motion through his contracted attorney. He's claiming that the personnel file with your records constitutes unlawful retention of classified information by the installation, and that it was placed without his knowledge or authorization. Mara understood what she was hearing. He's trying to be the one who reports it. He's trying to establish that he's a witness, not a subject. Solis's jaw was set. It's a reasonable legal strategy. It won't hold the memo with his signature is not the signature of someone who didn't know what was in the file, but it's going to slow things down. His attorney has already requested a stay on the secondary warrant. How long? 48 to 72 hours, potentially. Depending on how quickly a judge reviews the motion, she looked at Mara directly. In 72 hours, the ledger documentation has been reviewed by Sable's legal team, and anything they can dispute has been flagged. In 72 hours, anyone else on that contracting chain who hasn't already been contacted has been contacted by someone other than us. The courtyard was empty. Overhead, the light was going gray-blue with dusk. A handler, who called you, Mara, said Corporal Dye. She has photographs of the van and a partial plate. And she has dates, she said. She has documentation of Rex, the retired dog who was supposed to go to an adoption placement. I've spoken with Day. Her documentation is solid. If Day's records show Rex's supposed retirement date alongside the transaction ledger from the south building, that's exactly the connection I need, Solis said. That connection puts a named animal, a falsified retirement record, and a ledger entry in the same evidentiary chain. That's what survives a legal stay. She paused. But I need the original adoption paperwork for Rex. Fraudulent placement records. Those would have been processed through the facility's official K9 welfare office, which means there are physical files, not just digital records, somewhere in this installation. Aya looked at the administration building, the welfare office. Top door. On the left past the unit admin entrance, Solis confirmed. 5. The problem is the room is currently sealed pending general document review. I can't access it without the secondary warrant, and the stay request delays that warrant. Asa was quiet for a moment. I was given authorized access to the medical intake cabinet yesterday, she said. You were the animal welfare documentation for each K9 is technically part of the medical continuity record. The oversight committee contract specified full medical records access. Looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite surprise. Access termination paperwork. Used yesterday. Narrowed that scope. I signed acknowledgement of scope renegotiation, Mara said. Language of that document, as I read it when I signed it, states that my access is narrowed to surface health observations. It doesn't specify which physical locations within the facility I'm restricted from. A federal witness provision, issued this morning, supersedes contractor access limitations. The expression on Solis's face settled into something that was professional and careful and not disagreeing. I'll need whatever you find logged through me within 60 seconds of your access, she said. Every page photographed. Every photograph time-stamped and transferred immediately. Understood, Mara said. The K9 welfare office was like most rooms in the administration building, lit by fluorescents that buzzed slightly and smelled of the same industrial cleaner that permeated the whole facility. The filing system was an older configuration, physical files in color-coded folders, organized by animal registration number rather than by name, which meant locating Rex required knowing his registration number, which Mara did not have. She spent 3 minutes pulling folders, checking the intake sheets on the front of each one, looking for the registration number that corresponded to a dog named Rex, who had been assigned to Corporal Day's unit approximately 18 months ago. She found it in the fourth drawer. She tried a brown folder with a registration number that matched an intake date from 6 years prior, meaning Rex had been in the system for a long time before his supposed retirement. The retirement documentation was the last section of the folder. It looked completely correct. Transfer authorization signed. Receiving organization letterhead. A nonprofit K9 adoption program with an address in Ellsworth County. Veterinary clearance for transfer signed by the unit veterinarian. And handler recommendation signed. Every signature was present. Every form was complete. The formatting was identical to what legitimate retirement paperwork looked like. She photographed everything, every page, every signature. She transferred each photograph to Solis in real time the way she'd been asked to, watching the files. Leave her phone and move toward somewhere that wasn't a sealed room in a military installation. Then she looked at the receiving organization letterhead again. She photographed it separately isolated at higher resolution than the full-page shots. The organization name was Clearwater Companion Placement, Ellsworth County. There was a street address, a phone number, a website. She sent that photograph to Solis with a single text, "Verify this organization." She was closing the folder when Solis's response came back. Records. No record. She looked at the letterhead again. Address. The phone number, the website. All of it precise, all of it formatted correctly. None of it connected to anything real. Companion placement didn't exist. It had never existed. It was a name on a document designed to absorb a dog's disappearance and make it look like paperwork. 5. She had 11 folders in front of her. She started checking them in order. By the time she reached the 6th one, she had found 4 more non-existent organizations. Different names, different addresses, different formatting choices. All of them fictional. All of them used to document the paperwork trails of animals whose actual destination was a gray panel van in the north vehicle lot. She photographed everything and kept moving. It was dark when she came out of the administration building. Full dark. The facility's perimeter lighting had come on, throwing pools of orange light across the courtyard and the access roads, but the sky was gone from blue to black, and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. Ice was on the phone. She held up a hand when Mara approached, finished her call, and turned. "I have fraudulent placement organizations," Mara said. "I have documentation for 6 animals, Rex, and 5 others. All of them, with paperwork that traces to organizations that don't exist." "I have 4 more," Soli said. "We found a secondary file set in the south building. Different physical location. They were built into the back panel of a storage unit that was bolted to the wall." She said it without melodrama, just as a fact. Count is 10 animals with falsified retirement records. 5. Greaves is being processed by the county sheriff. He's asked for an attorney and hasn't said anything else. About the stay request, Solis's jaw moved. "The motion is under review. But I've submitted the fraudulent placement documentation. As an emergency, counterfiling falsified government records changes the legal calculus on the stay. I should have a response within 4 hours." She paused. 5. From Sable Mara waited. "He's not just filing a preemptive motion," Solis said. 5. "His attorney has submitted a formal claim that your presence on this facility, specifically your access to the welfare office, constitutes investigative overreach by an unauthorized civilian party, arguing that any documentation you gathered in the last 2 hours should be excluded." The courtyard was except for the buzz of the perimeter lights. "He knows what's in those files," Mara said. "He knows what's in those files," Solis agreed. 5. "And he knows that if the fraudulent placement documentation reaches the evidence chain before the stay is granted, the stay becomes irrelevant. So he's trying to contaminate the chain." She looked at Mara steadily. 5. "Your federal witness provision protects your access, and the welfare office argument has legal support. But this is going to become a deposition fight before it becomes a trial, and in a deposition fight, the side with more resources usually makes it more complicated than it needs to be." His resources. He spent 9 years building them. Solis rubbed her hand across her face in the first gesture Mara had seen from her that wasn't fully controlled. "Why? There's something else," the call from the facility that warned him. "We identified the line. 5. It came from the communications room in the unit command building. He has access to that room. Officially command staff only. But the log shows the line was accessed with a keycard registered to Hale. Huck is in custody." Solis paused. "His keycard is not. It was checked into the evidence inventory during processing. But there's a 12-minute gap between when Hale was escorted from the building and when his personal effects were inventoried. 12 minutes is enough time for someone to have used the card." Mara thought about the administration building, about the corridors she'd walked that afternoon, about the people she'd seen moving through them. She thought about London, who had sat across from her at a diner table that morning and told her about a building he couldn't describe and a family he was protecting. She thought about the fact that London had known when he sat across from her that this day was going to reach the point it had reached, and that knowing it hadn't stopped him from choosing which side to be on when it got there. She thought about the third person she'd seen in the kennel building that morning, a handler she'd registered but hadn't focused on, a man who had been present for her conversation with Day without appearing to listen. "Who was in the kennel building when I talked to Day," she said. Pulled up something on her tablet. According to the morning rotation log, 3 handlers were on shift for the eastern building during that window. A sergeant named Folks, and she stopped. Mara looked at the tablet. The third name on the rotation log was a corporal listed as on secondary assignment, which meant he was not technically assigned to the Eastern Kennel that morning, which meant he had no documented reason to be there. 5. His secondary assignment communications support unit command building. At him. Mara said, "We're already looking," Soli said, and her voice had shifted into the register of someone who is managing a situation that has just added a new moving part. He hasn't responded to a radio call in the last 40 minutes. His bunk room is empty. His personal vehicle is gone from the staff lot. The perimeter lights buzzed. 5. Somewhere inside the kennel building, Bug vocalized once briefly, and went quiet. I looked at Solis. "Doesn't just have a lawyer," she said. "He is someone inside this facility who can move and communicate and disappear. And that someone has a 40-minute head start." Solis was already on her phone. I thought about the memo in the file, the 2 lines of handwriting, like the photograph of the terrain. She thought about 7 years of carrying a finding that had told her she was wrong about something she knew she had been right about, and about the specific way that kind of thing lived in you. Not as grief exactly, and not as anger exactly, but as a persistent low-frequency wrongness that never fully integrated and never fully resolved. She thought about Warren Sable, who had signed his name to a document that reframed a dog's correct instinct as a failure, and who had then spent 9 years using the documentation of that decision as leverage against everyone around him, and who was now in a location she did not know, being informed by a lawyer that the situation at Greywall was no longer containable. She thought about what a man like that does when containment fails. She was still thinking about it when her phone lit up. A text to call, unregistered number, different from the one that had messaged her the night before, and when she answered it, the voice on the other end was older. Male-controlled in the way of someone who was performing control rather than experiencing it. The voice said, "I think it's time we spoke directly." She recognized the cadence before she confirmed the name. She had read enough of his written language in the last 3 hours that his spoken voice felt like a translation. "Victor Sable," she said. Russell's head turned. "You've been busy today," Sable said. "Hi. The file want you read to understand something the incident report? The memo, all of it, that documentation was placed in that building as part of a protected whistleblower record. I established 7 years ago. You're interpreting as falsification was my attempt to document wrongdoing by others. 5. You're holding the evidence of my effort to expose this, not participate in it. 5. It was delivered cleanly. It was a version of events that, if she hadn't spent the last several hours reading every page of what was in that file, might have been temporarily confusing. The memo recommends altering a dog service record," she said. "Your signature is on it. The memo documents a recommendation that was made to me by others and that I recorded to create a paper trail. The signature is in your name, not attributed. I can explain the context." "And explain it to Investigator Solis," Mara said. She's standing next to me. A pause, 3 seconds. Listen. His voice had not changed, but something underneath it had. "You were a very good medic and a very good handler. Whatever happened 7 years ago, whatever you believe happened, the record that came out of it was not designed to harm you specifically. It was a consequence of a larger set of decisions that I did not fully control." She was quiet. "What I'm telling you," he continued, "is that there are aspects of this situation that you don't have full visibility into, and that some of what you think you've found today may not mean what you think it means. And come in," she said. "Come to the facility. Sit in front of Investigator Solis and explain it." Other pause. Longer. "That's not something I'm in a position to do tonight." "Then we don't have anything to talk about," Mara said. The call, Solis was already moving, pulling a radio, issuing location tracing requests on the number. Mara handed over her phone without being asked, so the call log could be added to the record. She stood in the courtyard. The call had lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and it had told her several things. It had told her that Sable was not calm, regardless of what his voice was doing. It had told her that his legal strategy was preemptive narrative. He was trying to establish a version of events that could survive evidentiary scrutiny by framing himself as a hidden whistleblower rather than a hidden architect. It had told her that he had called her specifically rather than Solis because he believed she was the one whose read of the evidence most needed redirecting. And it had told her that he was not coming in, not tonight. Possibly, not voluntarily, Solis came back from the radio with her face set, in the particular way of someone who had received news in the last 30 seconds that confirmed something they had been trying to prevent. Couple's attorney has withdrawn the stay request, she said. Ara frowned. "That's good for us legally," Solis confirmed. "It means Sable no longer intends to use legal process to manage this situation." She paused. An hour ago, his attorney submitted the withdrawal and simultaneously filed a voluntary cooperation. Notice, Sable is claiming he intends to present himself to federal investigators within 24 hours. But we have no confirmation of his current location, and the corporal who accessed the communications room is still unaccounted for. 24 hours. A voluntary cooperation notice that had no teeth, no location attached to it, no timeline that could be enforced until it expired. Not going to present himself, Mara said. No, Solis said. But he's not. He's going to use 24 hours to move whatever he needs to move. I have a flag on his known associates and a travel advisory on his identification. But he's a former intelligence operative, she said it flatly. He knows how to move when he needs to. The courtyard was very quiet. Ada looked toward the kennel building. Through the wall she could not see Ghost, but she knew he was there, still lying against the mesh of the temporary pen, tracking whatever sounds reached him in the dark. She thought about the photograph in the file, the 2 flags on the mountain path, handwriting of an ordnance technician who had gone back and documented what the ground showed. Someone had done that. Someone had put that photograph in that file and kept it there for 7 years. Who was not Sable, because Sable would never have kept something that clearly exonerated a decision he had worked to bury. She had not asked Solis who had assembled the file. She had assumed it was Sable because his signature was on the memo, because his name was on the contracting records. A deadman's file assembled by the person it was designed to protect would contain exculpatory material about that person, not evidence of their culpability. What this file contained was a memo in Sable's hand that demonstrated his falsification, a photograph that proved the falsification, and a transaction ledger that connected him to years of criminal activity. This was not Sable's file. The file, she said, who had access to the South Building. Biometric access. To P. Hartwell, and Hartwell's name is on the incident report. File. Damages Hartwell. She was working through it out loud, because out loud was faster right now than in her own head where it could loop without resolution. But it damages Sable is the one who wrote the memo. Gospel is the one whose name appears on the contracting records. Well, but Sable is exposed. Solis had gone still. Would Hartwell keep a file that exposes Sable more than it exposes himself, Mara said. Yes, he wasn't keeping it to protect himself. He was keeping it to end Sable, Solis said slowly. Hartwell's been on this installation. For how long? Pulled her tablet assigned here 9 years ago. The South Building operation started. She looked up. Sable began appearing as a contracting authority. Sable pulled him in, Mara said, and Hartwell spent 9 years building a case he could use to get out from under him. She stopped. It's Hartwell now. Solis's expression shifted. In federal transport. He was moved to a processing facility 2 hours ago. He hasn't been charged yet. He's being held on the obstruction flag pending full review. He needs to be interviewed tonight, Mara said. Not tomorrow. Not during standard processing tonight. Because Sable knows that Hartwell is the one who assembled that file, and if Sable has 24 hours and a former intelligence background and someone on the inside who's already running, the first thing he does is find a way to make sure Hartwell doesn't get to say what he knows. Was already on her radio. In the kennel building, a dog made a sound in the dark. Somewhere outside the perimeter of Greywall Tactical Training Center, in a direction and at a distance that nobody currently knew, a car was moving through the night with a man in it, who had spent 9 years making sure he was never in a room he couldn't exit, and who had just watched every exit he'd built start to close at once. Was already on her radio. She made 3 calls in the space of 90 seconds, and Mara stood close enough to hear the shape of each one without catching every word: transport facility, interview authorization, priority classification. And by the time Solis lowered the radio, something had been set in motion that was going to reach Hartwell before anyone else did tonight. 40 minutes, Solis said. I'll have a team at the processing facility in 40 minutes. You need to be there yourself. I know. Solis was already moving toward the vehicle lot. Right. She stopped and turned. You should stay on site. There's a temporary witness accommodation in the East Building. It's not comfortable, but it's secure. I'm not staying on site, Mara said. Solis looked at her for a moment. The processing facility is a federal holding location. I know what I have access to and what I don't. Mara held Solis's gaze. But Hartwell has seen me. He's spoken to me. He knows I've read the file. Athens. If you walk in there with only investigators, he calculates what he needs to give you to protect himself. And he gives you exactly that and nothing more. I'm in the room. You're a civilian witness. I was in the stress pen when this started, Mara said. The reason Ghost didn't end up in a body bag in that training yard yesterday. The reason Day's documentation reached you today and not in another 6 months of transfer request denials. I'm not asking to lead the interview, I'm asking to be in the room. Was quiet for 2 seconds. 3. You're in the observation room, she said. Not the interview room. And if I tell you to stop, you stop. I agreed. Let's go. The drive to the processing facility took 37 minutes on roads that were mostly empty at this hour. Upland, giving way to the lighter commercial sprawl of Dunmore's outer edge, and then the utility corridors and low industrial buildings of the district where Federal Holding was located. Drove. She didn't make small talk, and Mara didn't either. They listened to Soli's radio, which delivered updates in the abbreviated language of active operations, transport status, perimeter check-ins, a flag on Sable's known travel documents that had so far produced nothing. The corporal who had fled the installation, his name Mara had learned was Aldrich Fenn, had not yet been located. His personal vehicle had been spotted by a county patrol unit on a highway heading northwest of Dunmore, but the patrol had not had authorization to stop him at the time, and by the time the authorization came through, the vehicle had exited the highway at an interchange with 4 different route options, and the trail had gone cold. Had flagged him on the federal system, which meant his identification would trigger an alert if used at any monitored crossing or transport hub. A man who had access to a former intelligence operatives network might have options that didn't require monitored identification. Sat with that and watched the dark road. The processing facility was a low building behind a second perimeter fence, the kind of place designed to be functionally invisible, no signage visible from the road, lighting that illuminated the building without advertising it, a parking arrangement that kept vehicles off the direct sightline of the adjacent industrial road. His credentials moved them through 2 checkpoints without delay. Otwell was in a holding interview room on the building's east wing. They gave Mara the observation room adjacent, which was separated from the interview space by a one-way panel and had a speaker system that picked up the room audio clearly. She sat in a chair against the wall and waited. Solis entered the interview room at 9:51. Otwell was already seated. He had the look of a man who had spent several hours in a holding room, doing the math on his situation, not panicked, but compressed, like something had been tightened down through the middle of him. He was still in his facility clothes, and someone had given him a paper cup of coffee that he had not touched. Set her tablet on the table and started the recorder without ceremony. Hector Hartwell. I want to talk about Warren Sable. Hartwell looked at the recorder, then at Solis, then at the one-way panel, which he could not see through, but could clearly identify for what it was. Found the file. He said, we found the file. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the paper cup, looked at it, put it down without drinking. How much of it did you read? All of it. Something in his posture shifted. Relief, not exactly. Something more like the specific physical response of a person who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down, even if the reason they can set it down is not the reason they'd hoped for. I assembled that file over 4 years, he said. Starting from the 3rd year I was at Greywall. From when I understood what the South Building was actually being used for, and that Sable's name was on the contracts that authorized it. He looked at the table. I was involved. About that, I knew about the South Building for approximately 14 months before I began documenting it. During those 14 months, I did nothing to stop it. He said it without deflection, which was not what Mara had expected. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't make me responsible for what happened to those animals during that period. Changed at 14 months, Solis asked Rex. He said it simply. I knew Rex. He'd been on this installation for 6 years. He was Day's dog. I had watched that dog work. I had watched Day handle him. He stopped. When Greaves came for Rex, I was the one who processed the paperwork. I was the one who filled out the transfer authorization to an organization that didn't exist. And I stood at the edge of the north lot and watched them load him into the van. He paused. I couldn't make the math work anymore. Whatever Sable had over me, whatever the consequences of documenting this were, I couldn't make the math work. Through the speaker in the observation room, Mara heard that and held it without moving. A file. Solis said the photograph of the mountain terrain, the ordnance confirmation photograph. Where did you get that? Hartwell looked up. Sable gave it to me. Office waited. Not intentionally, Hartwell clarified. I came onto this installation. Sable gave me a briefing package context on key personnel, historical incidents that had affected the facility, information. He wanted me to have, because he wanted me to understand the leverage structure he operated under. The photograph was part of that package. His point was that he had documentation of a classified incident that could be deployed against multiple parties if necessary. He was showing me the shape of what he could do, he exhaled. He never imagined I'd use it against him. He thought it was a deterrent. Did he know you'd put the photograph in the file? Oh. He knew I had access to the south building. He gave me biometric access because he needed someone on site with administrative authority to manage logistics. He did not know I was using that access to build a case against him. Hartwell looked at his hands. I suspect that changes tonight. It changed approximately 2 hours ago, Solis said. He's called his attorney and filed a voluntary cooperation notice. He's claiming the file was a whistleblower record he established himself. Hartwell made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Of course he is. Is there anything in the file that supports that claim? Oh, he said it without hesitation. The memo in his handwriting is exactly what it looks like. Directed the reclassification of that handler's service record and that dog's behavioral assessment to protect the incident report findings from scrutiny. He directed it because if the correct finding that the dog stopped correctly, that there was a secondary device had been officially recorded, the K9 program's evaluation methodology would have been reviewed. A review would have reached back to procurement. Procurement would have reached Sable's contracts. He paused. He buried a dog's instinct to protect a contracting network. And then he used the documentation of that burial to control everyone who knew about it. Through the one-way panel, Mar was very still, the handler, Solis said carefully, whose record was altered. Did you know who she was before today? Well, looked at the one-way panel again, directly at it in a way that was not a coincidence. I knew the name on the file. He said Mara Sutton. I knew she'd been assigned a contractor review at this facility. I didn't request her. He paused, but I didn't prevent it either. The night extended past midnight. His interview with Hartwell ran for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and by the time it concluded, the shape of what had been built at Greywall over 9 years was documented in sufficient detail that 3 separate prosecutor offices had been contacted and were preparing to file. Hartwell had been precise. He knew names, dates, transaction amounts, method of animal transport, the identities of the receiving parties at the other end of Greaves's van runs, and the financial routing that Sable had used to keep his name one layer removed from the actual transactions. He knew which of the Greywall handlers had been paid to look away, and which had genuinely not known. He knew that Hale had understood what the South Building contained, but had been kept ignorant of Sable's direct involvement, a deliberate compartmentalization that Sable had maintained to preserve Hale's usefulness as a buffer. He also knew something he gave to Solis at the end of the interview in a quieter voice, as though it cost him something different than the rest of it had cost. Apple has a secondary property, he said, not in his name. It's registered to a holding company, Vantis Consolidated. It's about 60 miles northwest of Dunmore. He bought it 4 years ago through a private transaction that never appeared in any of his public financial disclosures. He slid a piece of paper across the table handwritten, which he had apparently prepared before they'd even arrived, which meant he'd been planning to give it to someone, had been waiting for someone to show up who could receive it. That's the address. That's the holding company registration number. And that's the name of the man Sable uses to manage the property. Solis took the paper without rushing. She looked at it. You're certain of this? I've been certain of this for 2 years, Hartwell said. I was waiting to be sure I could give it to someone who would actually use it. Solis looked at him for a moment. You could have come forward at any point. No, he didn't make an excuse. He just acknowledged it. No, the drive back toward Dunmore happened in partial silence. Solis was on the phone for most of it, coordinating with the county sheriff's office, with federal transport personnel who were being redirected to a location 60 miles northwest of where they currently were. Sat in the passenger seat and watched the road and thought about a property registered to Vantis Consolidated and a man with a 40-minute head start who knew by now that every documented exit had been identified. They were 20 minutes from the Greywall facility when Solis's radio produced a different kind of transmission, not an update but an alert. Particular tone of a vehicle identification flag. Grab the radio, say again. The response came through clearly. A vehicle matching the description of Sable's registered secondary car. A dark blue sedan known plate had been captured by a private road camera at an intersection 12 miles north of Dunmore. The camera was part of a commercial property security system. The timestamp was 46 minutes ago. The vehicle was heading north, heading toward Dunmore, not away from it. Solis said something under her breath that was not quite a word and recalculated. He's not running northwest. she said. He's not going to the property. Already knows. We have the address, Mara said. Stein called him. Then where is he going? Mara thought about the call. Options. Minutes and 20 seconds, the controlled voice, the alternative narrative, the specific choice to call her rather than Solis. The he'd said whatever you believe happened about a 7-year-old incident, as though her read of it was a matter of perspective rather than documented fact. He had called her to redirect her, and when that hadn't worked, he'd filed a voluntary cooperation notice that gave him 24 hours and no obligation to specify a location. He had been planning to run and then something had changed. He's not running, she said slowly. He's coming to Greywall. Ice looked at her. He has something on site, Mara said. Something that isn't in the south building. Something that wasn't in the file Hartwell assembled. He filed the cooperation notice to buy time to get to it, and he's driving toward the facility right now, because if he doesn't reach it before we do. Ice had the radio up before Mara finished the sentence. Units at Greywall. This is Solis. I need an immediate perimeter lock. No personnel exit beginning now. I need confirmation. The confirmation came back in pieces. 2 units and then a third and then a fourth voice that was slightly different. Not a federal unit, a facility security officer who was on overnight duty at the gate. This is gate security. There's already a vehicle at the north perimeter. Dark sedan. Presented federal contractor credentials, requested emergency facility access. We were holding for authorization. A pause. He said his name is Warren Sable. He said he has documentation relevant to the federal investigation and he needs to turn it over in person. A video crackled. Solis said, do not open that gate. Their pause. Longer than it should have been. Agent Solis. He's showing a badge. Do not open that gate. The road ahead was dark. Moore's lights were visible on the horizon, and beyond them the scrubland, and beyond that the chain-link perimeter of Greywall, with its tilted sign and its orange perimeter lighting, and a dark blue sedan idling at the north gate, with a man in the driver's seat who had calculated incorrectly that showing up was still an option. But that was the problem with men who had built their safety out of leverage and documentation and other people's fear. When those things ran out, what they defaulted to was showing up. Standing in front of you, insisting in person on a version of events that they were still capable of believing because they had spent years constructing it from the inside. He's going to try to give himself to us, Mara said. Fine. No on his terms with his documentation. Whatever's on that facility that he came back for, he's going to try to frame coming back for it as voluntary cooperation. He's going to say he drove to Greywall to hand it over. Solis said again. But the gate security officer has already been on the radio with you, and the timestamp on that call is logged, and the camera at the intersection 12 miles north put him in that direction 46 minutes ago. And none of that matches a man who spontaneously decided to cooperate. She paused. He doesn't know about the intersection camera. Solis was already calculating. If he walks in voluntarily with documentation he claims exonerates him, and we have no immediate counter to whatever that documentation says. In the facility that he came back for, Mara said. Think about what we haven't found. We have the south building. We have the welfare files. We have Hartwell's file. We have the ledger. She went through it systematically. That's missing from a 9-year operation that produced this level of organized activity. Drove and thought 30 seconds. Communications, she said. Operational communications. How Greaves was directed. The receiving parties were contacted. How Sable managed the financial routing from a distance without his name appearing on transactions. She looked at Mara briefly. Infrastructure has to exist somewhere. It wasn't in the south building. It wasn't in any of the administrative files. It's something that runs parallel to the official facility systems. Secondary communication setup, Mara said. In a location that requires physical access. That only 2 people on this installation have biometric access to. They looked at each other. The south building, Mara said. We were in the main room, the documentation room. Hartwell said the secondary file set was built into the back panel of a storage unit that was bolted to the wall. She paused. What was behind the storage unit? Solis grabbed the radio again. The team at Greywall had not moved the storage unit. They had documented it, photographed it, cataloged its exterior, and moved on to higher priority evidence during the warrant execution. The unit itself, a heavy metal storage cabinet, at 4 points to the south wall of the south building, had not been unbolted and moved because nothing in the initial walkthrough had suggested there was anything behind it beyond the facility's concrete exterior wall. In 43, 2 investigators unbolted the cabinet. Behind it was a door. not a large door. Steel-faced recessed into the wall in a way that the cabinet's installation had been specifically designed to conceal. It had a keypad and a secondary biometric reader, different from the one on the building's main entrance. More current hardware. More expensive, the investigators called Solus. Was 2 minutes from the facility. She arrived at 11:45. Mara was 3 steps behind her. Secondary biometric reader accepted Hartwell's credentials. Solus had them from the processing facility, transferred via secure line, and the door opened. The space behind it was not a room. It was a corridor short 4 meters leading to a second room that was approximately the size of a large closet. And it were 2 servers, a communications relay unit, an encrypted radio array, and a filing cabinet that was unlocked. The filing cabinet contained 6 years of printed transaction records, contact directories for 23 seizing parties in 4 states, encrypted routing codes for 3 financial accounts, and a set of handwritten logs that documented in clean and organized detail every movement of every animal that had passed through Greaves's van, Rex, including 8 other dogs whose retirement paperwork had listed non-existent placement organizations and whose actual destinations were logged. In Sable's own handwriting, she recognized it from the memo with the receiving party name, transaction amount, and in several cases a notation that delivered confirmed. The handwriting was unmistakable. She had read enough of it in the last 12 hours to know it the way you know the specific grammar of someone who has put their intentions into writing more times than they realized. Was on the phone before the filing cabinet was fully open. Ara stood in the corridor outside the small room and looked at what was in front of her. She had been in a lot of small rooms in her life, administrative rooms, medical rooms, field positions that were technically classified as rooms, but were really just covered spaces where people made decisions under pressure. She knew what it felt like when a room contained something that was going to change the shape of what came next. This room contained 9 years of operational documentation that Warren Sable had personally maintained, personally annotated, and personally returned to this facility tonight to retrieve. He was still at the north gate. The gate security officer had confirmed the vehicle had not moved. Solus made the call herself. Clear and direct federal detention authorization active warrant. The subject at the north gate was to be placed in custody immediately. She gave the case number, the warrant reference, and her own badge identification in the efficient shorthand of someone who had done this enough times to strip all unnecessary language. Aya walked back through the south building and out into the cold night air. She stood outside while the radio traffic completed its circuit gate security, federal unit confirmation acknowledgement. She could not see the north gate from where she was. She could hear faintly the sound of a car engine being shut off, and voices multiple at a distance, then quiet. The arrest of Warren Sable took 11 minutes and was accomplished without incident, which was the kind of ending that real situations often had, and that nobody found satisfying, not dramatic, not visual. Just a man in a parking lot being told that the thing he'd driven back to retrieve was already in someone else's hands, that the door he'd come back to open had already been opened, and that the 24 hours he'd bought himself had contracted to approximately 4, which had turned out to be enough for everything except the one thing he'd actually needed. Ada stood in the cold and looked up at the Greywall perimeter lights. She thought about the mountain, about Rook stopping, the 40 seconds between the stop and the confirmation, 40 seconds in which she had trusted a dog's instinct over a direct order and had been standing in a review board, 6 weeks later being told that the instinct didn't count, that the compliance failure was the only part of the record that mattered. She had carried that for 7 years. She carried it now still in the specific way that things don't stop being true because they've been explained. The explanation didn't make the 7 years not have happened. The documentation in the room behind her didn't undo the incident report that was still technically in her service file. It existed now in a federal evidence chain in Solus's hands, with Hartwell's testimony, and the photograph of the mountain and the ordnance notation, and a memo in Sable's own handwriting telling someone to alter a record. That was different. Everything. Different. Materially, legally, documentably different. Solus came out of the south building and walked to where Mara was standing. She looked tired in the way of someone who had been running at high capacity since before this morning and had several more hours still ahead. She stood beside Mara without saying anything for a moment. Then the communications room is being processed. Filing cabinet contents will be in full evidentiary review by morning. She paused. I found a record in the filing cabinet. A log entry from 7 years ago. Documents a payment. A small one. relative to the others made to an administrative contact at the military review board that processed your discharge. I looked at her. We don't know yet what the payment was for, Solis said carefully. It may be for something entirely separate, but the timing aligns with the period of your review board, and the contact list is a name we're going to need to pull records on. She held her own gaze steady. I want you to understand what I'm telling you. I'm not promising an outcome. But what's in that cabinet is enough to open a full review of your military discharge classification and the incident report findings. But that is a formal process. It will take time, but it's going to happen. The perimeter lights hummed. I know, Mara said. Her voice was steady. Not because she felt steady. She felt something that was still in the process of becoming a feeling. Something that needed more time than she had right now to fully arrive. I know it takes time. There's one more thing, Solis said. Chicago waited. Sable's arrest is going to produce a press release through federal channels by morning. Standard procedure. The warrant scope, the charges, the facility action. Your name is in the incident report, which is in the evidence chain, which means it will surface in the documentation. She paused. People are going to know who you are before this is finished. Before the review board convenes, before the formal record is corrected. There's a window where the story is public, but the outcome isn't settled. I understand. Some people find that window very difficult. Mara looked out past the perimeter lights toward the scrubland toward the dark. I've been in a 7-year window. She said this one has an end. I nodded. Once. She went back inside. There was more to do. There would be more to do for several days at minimum, and Mara's role in it had not concluded. There were animals to document, behavioral records to build from scratch. A veterinary triage process that needed someone who understood the difference between physical injury and psychological damage. There were depositions coming, and formal witness statements, and the kind of institutional aftermath that took longer than the crisis itself, and was less visible and equally necessary. But right now in the courtyard, a radio confirmed the transport of Warren Sable. Was in a holding facility on the east side of Dunmore. Greaves was in county custody. The corporal had been picked up at a truck stop 40 miles northwest. His identification, flagged with Solis's system, had been set up to flag it, which was how that kind of thing usually ended, not dramatically, but correctly. Aya walked back toward the kennel building. Ghost was still in the temporary pen, and he was awake. And when she sat down beside the mesh, he pressed his head against it, the way he'd been doing for hours, not frantic, not distressed, just present, tracking her. The way a dog tracks a person they've decided to orient toward. She sat with him in the quiet and did not try to make it into anything more than it was. A cold building at the end of a long day. A dog who was alive and fed and no longer alone, and a woman who was beginning carefully to understand that the thing she'd come into this facility to find was not on a contractor form or in a filing cabinet or in an evidence chain. She'd found it in a stress pen on the first day when she'd lowered herself to one knee and refused to fight. But she was also going to need the evidence chain. Things you needed both. She stayed until Ghost's eyes closed. Then she leaned her head back against the wall and let her own close for a while. She didn't sleep, but she rested, and in the morning, when Solis's team came back and the second phase of the investigation began, and when the federal press release went out, and 3 different news outlets picked up the story, and the name Greywall Tactical Training Center began appearing in contexts that Hale and Sable had spent years ensuring it never would when all of that started, Tasha was already awake, already documented, already at the table, not asking permission, not explaining herself. Just doing the work that needed, doing the way she always had, in the particular way of a person who had learned long ago that the most useful thing you could be in a room was the person who stayed when everyone else expected you to leave. The press release named 4 individuals in connection, the federal action. Named Greaves Hale Fenn as a named suspect at large, which he was no longer, but the release had been finalized before his pickup, and Warren Sable, former senior oversight consultant, currently in federal custody, pending formal arraignment on charges including conspiracy, falsification of government records, trafficking in military assets, and obstruction of a federal investigation. It did not name Mara, but buried in the 3rd paragraph, in language that was careful and legally reviewed and factually precise, was a single sentence. The investigation was initiated following an assessment report filed by a contracted medical reviewer whose observations triggered the formal oversight response. She read it on her phone in the Canole building at 7:15 in the morning with Ghost beside her and a cup of coffee from the gas station diner that had gone cold somewhere between the parking lot and here. Sentence, 7 years. She read it twice. And then she put her phone in her jacket pocket and she went to work. The work was not glamorous, and it was not fast. That was the first thing people got wrong about the aftermath of something like this. They imagined resolution as a moment, a door closing a clean line between what was and what came after. What actually happened was more like water, finding it slow, persistent, following the path of least resistance when it could, and forcing new channels when it couldn't. 5. The investigation produced paperwork that produced more paperwork. 5. The legal filings produced counterfilings. The arraignment produced a postponement and then a second arraignment date. 5. The Federal Review of Greywall's K-9 program produced a preliminary report that produced a formal audit that produced a list of recommendations that were sent to 3 separate command authorities for review. Law stayed for all of it. Not because she had her formal witness obligation concluded 10 days after Sable's arrest. Her deposition was taken in a federal building in Dunmore by 2 attorneys and a stenographer in a room that smelled like old carpet and recycled air. She answered every question directly. She did not embellish and she did not minimize. She described what she had seen in what order with what timing. The deposition ran 4 hours and 20 minutes, and at the end of it she signed the transcript and walked out into a gray afternoon feeling, not triumphant but wrung. The way you feel after any sustained effort that required you to be more precise than you naturally are. She stayed because Ghost was still in the temporary kennel. Because 7 of the 11 South Building animals were still in the facility veterinary infirmary, 3 of them still undergoing treatment for conditions that the emergency team had stabilized but not resolved. Because Corporal Day had been formally reassigned to light administrative duty pending the internal review of her transfer request denial, and was spending her days in a borrowed office doing paperwork that had nothing to do with dogs. And there was no one else at Greywall who understood the animals the way Day did or the way Mara had come to, and the animals needed people who understood them. She also stayed because she had nowhere else to go that was more important than here, and she had learned over the course of a long time and several difficult experiences to pay attention when that was the case. And the arraignment hearing for Warren Sable took place 6 weeks after his arrest. It was held in a federal district court 40 miles from Dunmore, in a building that was larger and more formal than anything in Greywall's immediate geography, a high ceiling and wooden benches and the particular acoustic quality of rooms designed for consequential speech. R did not attend. She watched the public broadcast feed on her laptop in the office space. She'd been given at the facility a small room adjacent to the veterinary infirmary that had previously been used for supply storage and still smelled faintly of antiseptic and cardboard. She watched it on a 12-inch screen with the volume low enough that she had to lean forward to hear clearly. Sable entered the courtroom in civilian clothes. He was composed in the way of a man who had spent his entire professional life in rooms where composure was currency, and who had not yet accepted that composure was no longer the relevant currency. He was 61 years old, well-dressed in a gray suit, and he stood for the reading of the charges with his hands at his sides and his chin level. The charges were read in the flat recitative of the court officer: conspiracy to defraud the federal government, falsification of official military records, unlawful trafficking of government assets, obstruction of a federal investigation, and the charge that had been added 14 days after the initial arrest, after the financial routing records from the communications room had been fully decrypted wire fraud across state lines for the purpose of commercial benefit. 6 counts. Possible entered a plea of not guilty to all charges. His attorney, a woman from a well-resourced firm in the capital, entered motions that were noted and dated and would take months to resolve. Judge set a trial date. Mara watched the feed until the courtroom cleared, and then she closed the laptop and sat in the storage room office and held still for a moment. She had known this was coming. She had understood from the first time Solis had explained the legal timeline, that arraignment was a beginning, not an ending, and that the trial itself was still months away and would be complicated and expensive, and would involve her again in testimony rooms and procedural communications. She understood all of that. What she hadn't fully anticipated was how she would feel watching him stand there, not angry, not relieved, but something older and less clean than either of those. The feeling of watching a thing begin its formal reckoning and knowing that the reckoning was correct and necessary and was going to be very slow. She gave herself 10 minutes, then she went back to work. Lyle's case resolved faster. His attorney negotiated a plea arrangement in the 8th week, a reduction on 2 of the charges in exchange for full cooperation with the investigation into Sable's contracting network. Cooperation was substantive. Hale knew the operational structure in detail because he had managed it locally, and his testimony about the communication protocols between Greywall and Sable's contracting office added material documentation to the federal case. The plea arrangement did not spare him consequence. He received a formal dishonorable discharge, stripped of rank, and a sentence of 4 years with the possibility of reduction for cooperative conduct. The military tribunal that processed his discharge conducted it in the same facility where he had commanded for 9 years, which was either poetic or simply efficient, depending on how you looked at it. Aya did not attend that either. She learned about it from Solis, who called her on a Tuesday morning with an update that was factual and brief, the way Solis communicated everything. As plea entered, Solis had discharge finalized. 4 years. His cooperation is on record, good, Mara said. As Greaves is next. His attorney has been requesting delays, but the physical evidence is substantial enough that the prosecution isn't particularly worried about the delays. What about Fenn? Fenn is cooperating fully. He was Sable's point of contact on the installation used for communication interception and early warning. Operation is what confirmed the timeline of the warning call, the night of the arrest, a pause. He's young, 24. He got pulled into something he didn't build, and then stayed in it too long because he didn't know how to get out. The prosecutor's office is treating him accordingly. Ara thought about that. What does accordingly mean? Reduced charges. Supervised release. He'll have a record, but he's not looking at years. Solis paused again. Fine. That might not sit right with you. He was 24 in a system built by men with decades of experience at manipulation, Mara said. It sits where it sits, that was honest. It didn't entirely sit right with her. She had some difficulty with the idea of easy exits for people who had made the calls they'd made, but it sat within the range of things she could accept as proportionate. And she had learned over time that proportionate and satisfying were not the same category. The formal Terry review of Mara's discharge record and the incident report was initiated in the 10th week. She received the notification by certified mail to the Dunmore motel address she'd given as her current location, in an official envelope, with a return address that she had not seen in 7 years, and that she sat with for 3 minutes before opening. The notification informed her that a review board had been convened under the authority of the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, in response to evidence obtained during the Greywall federal investigation pertaining to the classification and documentation of her forward deployment discharge. The review board would examine the original incident report, the ordnance confirmation photograph, the payment record discovered in the Sable Communications Archive, and supporting testimony from identified witnesses, including Hartwell and 2 individuals whose names she did not recognize, but who were identified as former members of the original review board. The review process would take a minimum of 60 days and a maximum of 6 months. She put the letter on the desk in the storage room office and went back to the veterinary infirmary. 3 dogs were still in recovery, and one of them, a shepherd named Volta, who had come out of the south building with a respiratory infection and ligature damage to both front legs, was having a bad morning and needed someone with her. Volta was not an easy dog. She had never been an easy dog, probably, but 9 months in the south building had made her suspicious of hands and loud a voice, and deeply resistant to any handling that involved restraint, even therapeutic restraint for wound care. Aya had been working with her for 6 weeks. Slowly, the way you work with a dog who has learned that proximity to people means pain, not pushing, not retreating. Just being present in a way that was consistent and low demand until the consistency itself became a form of safety. That morning, Volta let Mara apply the wound dressing to her right foreleg without pulling away. It was a small thing. It had taken 6 weeks. Mara noted it in the behavioral log without editorializing the way good documentation worked, fact, time, context. She did not write this felt significant even though it did. She wrote animal tolerated full wound care procedure without withdrawal or vocalization. And she sat beside Volta's kennel for another 20 minutes and let the dog decide whether to come closer or not. Volta came closer. Greaves entered a guilty plea in the 12th week. His attorney had run out of delay options, and the physical evidence, the communications archive, the transaction ledger, the financial routing, the 10 animals documented with falsified retirement records was comprehensive enough that a trial was not a strategic choice. He pleaded guilty to trafficking in government assets, wire fraud, and conspiracy. His sentencing hearing was scheduled for the following month, and the prosecutor's office had submitted a recommendation for 7 years. Sentencing hearing produced 8. The judge cited the scope of the operation, the duration of the conduct, and the specific finding that the commercial exploitation had been conducted systematically and deliberately over a multi-year period, with full awareness of the animal's condition and provenance. Mara read about it in the evening on her phone, sitting in the temporary kennel building with Ghost. He was no longer in a temporary pen. He had been moved 3 weeks earlier into a permanent kennel space that was larger and better ventilated and had outdoor access, and the change in him had been gradual but real. He was still cautious. He still startled at sudden sounds. He still paced sometimes in the late afternoon, which Dr. Tom said was likely a behavioral residue of the years of confinement that might never fully resolve. But he ate well and he slept, and when Mara came into the building, he tracked her with his eyes and stood and came to the kennel door in a way that was not frantic but specific. The way a dog comes to the door when the person arriving is the particular person they've been waiting for. She read the sentencing news and looked at Ghost and thought about Rex, whose fate she knew from the ledger records and which she had not written in the behavioral log and did not intend to. Some things were documentable and some things were just true and needed to be held differently. She stayed until the lights in the kennel building cycled to their night setting, and then she went to the motel. The review board convened in its formal session in the 14th week. Traveled to the federal building where it was held 3 hours by train from Dunmore, a city with wider streets and taller buildings, and the ambient noise of a place that had more going on in it than scrubland and military corridors. The board was 5 people, officers, a legal examiner, a civilian oversight representative, and a behavioral assessment specialist who had been brought in specifically because the central question of the review, whether a canine handler's judgment had been correctly or incorrectly evaluated, required expertise that the standard board composition did not include. The session ran 2 days. On the first day, the documentary evidence was presented, the original incident report, the ordnance confirmation photograph, the payment record, the memo in Sable's handwriting, and Hartwell's formal testimony, submitted in writing and read into the record by the legal examiner. Ada sat in the hearing room and listened to a reconstruction of a decision that had been made about her 7 years ago, in language that was formal and procedural, that had the specific quality of institutional language, acknowledging by careful step that something had gone wrong. On the second day, she testified. She was not nervous exactly. She was the particular kind of alert that comes from knowing that what you say is going to be precise and truthful, and that precision and truth are sometimes insufficient, and that you do it anyway because it's what you have. She answered the board's questions in order. She described the mountain operation. She described rook stopping. She described the 40 seconds. She described the original review board, the findings, the discharge classification. She described what the 7 years after had looked like, not as a grievance, but as a factual account of a person navigating a professional and personal landscape that had been altered by a record that was false. At the end of her testimony, the behavioral assessment specialist, a woman named Dr. Barua, who had been taking notes throughout and whose expression had been consistently attentive, in a way that Mara had found without anticipating it, steadying, asked a single question that was not in the formal submission. That in your assessment, Dr. Barua said, was the dog's behavior during that operation a failure of handler direction or a correct operational response? Quiet. It was a correct operational response, Mara said. He stopped because there was something to stop for. Nice. That's what he'd been trained to do. He did it exactly right. Dr. Barua wrote something, nodded once briefly, and then looked at the board chair, indicating she was finished. The board deliberated for 6 hours. The finding was delivered in writing, handed to Mara by the legal examiner in an envelope at 4:47 in the afternoon in the corridor outside the hearing room, which was not a dramatic location for the delivery of a document she had spent 7 years waiting for, but was the actual location, because real things happen in actual places, regardless of whether the setting is appropriate. She opened it in the corridor. The finding was 4 pages. She read all 4. The formal language was careful, did not, as a practice, admit institutional wrongdoing in explicit terms, preferring language that described findings as corrections of documentation rather than acknowledgments of error. The content was unambiguous. The original incident report findings were formally reclassified. The behavioral assessment of the assigned K9 was amended to reflect correct operational response. The handler's discharge classification was upgraded. The official service record was corrected. On page 3, one paragraph contained a sentence that was not standard board language. She read it twice, The board further notes that the handler's subsequent actions in the matter of Greywall Tactical Training Center, resulting in the identification and documentation of systemic misconduct affecting multiple animals and personnel, are consistent with the judgment and capability that her service record correctly understood has always reflected. She stood in the corridor for a while. She did not cry. That was not a point of pride. It was just what happened. 5. The feeling that arrived was not the sharp immediate feeling of a moment she'd imagined many times. It was something slower, something that moved through her the way warmth moves through a room that has been cold for a long time, not a rush, but a gradual change in what the air felt like. She folded the envelope, put it in her jacket pocket, and took the train back to Dunmore. 3 months later, the formal restructuring of Greywall's K-9 program was completed. The military audit that Solis's investigation had triggered produced a comprehensive set of operational changes, new welfare standards, mandatory independent veterinary review, handler, evaluation protocols that prioritized relationship quality over compliance metrics, and a formal grievance pathway for handlers who identified welfare concerns. Was offered a position, not contractor, not temporary access, not a badge that said medical temporary in red letters. A permanent appointment, jointly authorized by the facility command structure and the DoD Oversight Office as Director of K-9 Rehabilitation and Handler Development. 5. The appointment came with a salary and office that was not a converted storage room, and formal authority over the welfare program for every animal on the installation. 5. She sat with the offer for 4 days, was not sure she wanted to be at Greywall permanently. 5. She was not sure Greywall deserved her, which was a thought she recognized as partly ego and partly legitimate, and she sat with the tension between those two readings without trying to resolve it prematurely. 5. She thought about Ghost, who was recovering well and would need continued behavioral work for another year at minimum. 5. She thought about Day, whose transfer request had been formally denied as a punitive action and had therefore been overturned in the program review, 5. And who had chosen to stay because she knew the animals and because leaving felt like abandoning something she'd started. 5. She thought about what she would do somewhere else instead and found that she didn't have a clear answer. 5. She accepted the position on the 4th day. 5. The day she formally signed the appointment paperwork, she walked the facility from one end to the other. Not an inspection. She was not performing for anyone. Oftens. Just walking through the administration building with its corrected files and its new welfare office that was now staffed 2 days a week by Dr. Wethaman, who had agreed to a consulting arrangement. 5. Through the kennel buildings, which had been reconfigured to meet the new space standards, wider pens, and consistent water access and outdoor runs that were used on actual schedules. 5. Through the east training yard, which she passed without breaking stride, and past the north vehicle lot where a gray panel van was no longer parked. She walked to the south building last. It had been partially decommissioned. The secondary communications room was sealed pending final evidence processing, and the main room where the 11 dogs had been found was no longer being used. A decision about the building's future use had not been made. It stood at the back of the facility property with the quality of a place that everyone knew the purpose of and nobody wanted to name directly. She stood outside it for a moment. She thought about what had been inside it. She thought about the dogs who had come out of it, 3 transferred to a military veterinary hospital, 2 counties north still there and improving, 4 placed in long-term rehabilitation at a civilian facility connected to Dr. Almond's county network, 4 still here including Volta, including a young shepherd named Keys who had arrived mute with stress and had begun in recent weeks to make sounds again. Sounds. Tentative like a language he was remembering. She turned away from the south building and walked back toward the kennels. Ghost was waiting at the door of his outdoor run, which he did sometimes in the late afternoon, when the angle of the light changed, not frantic, not demanding, just present. Just at the door, watching the direction she usually came from, oriented toward her approach, with the patient absolute attention of a dog who had decided that this was where he belonged. She opened the run gate and he came out and walked beside her without a leash, which they had been working toward for 2 months, and which he did now with the ease of something learned and settled. They walked the eastern perimeter road together the long way, and she did not try to make it mean more than it was. A dog, walking beside a person who understood him. A person walking beside a dog who trusted her, half of them alive and outside, and moving through the late afternoon, without fear. John Sable's trial began 5 months after his arraignment. It ran 11 days. Mara testified on day 4. She traveled back to the federal district courthouse, sat in the same corridored building, and answered questions from the prosecution for 2 hours, and from the defense for another 90 minutes. The defense attorney was competent in trying to hide, and her strategy was to establish that Mara's read of events was shaped by personal grievance, that a woman whose service record had been damaged by her client's decisions had motivations beyond factual reporting. Mara answered every question the same way she answered every question, precisely, without embellishment, without shrinking. When the defense attorney suggested that her presence at Greywall had been motivated by a personal agenda, she said, "I was contracted by the Federal Oversight Committee to conduct a medical assessment. I conducted it. What I found is in the documentation." When the defense attorney suggested that her interpretation of the behavioral records was influenced by her prior relationship with the K-9 program, she said, "My interpretation is consistent with established behavioral science literature on aversive conditioning. Dr. Omen's veterinary findings independently corroborate it." You can cross-examine the literature. The defense attorney moved on. 5. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict was guilty on 4 of 6 counts: conspiracy, falsification of military records, obstruction, and wire fraud. 5. The 2 trafficking counts were partially reduced due to the indirect nature of Sable's transactional involvement, which the defense had successfully argued. The prosecution considered the partial reduction a minor setback within an overall successful outcome, and said so in their post-verdict statement. Sentencing was scheduled 6 weeks after verdict. Sable received 9 years. Given his age and the nature of his involvement, the architecture of the operation, rather than its physical execution, the judge additionally imposed a permanent ban from any federal contracting or oversight role. 9 years. Permanent ban. Mara read the sentencing in the evening, same as she'd read every other update on her phone. Sitting in the kennel building, or the small office, or the motel room. She'd finally given up after the 3rd month and replaced with a rented room in a house 2 miles from the facility, owned by a retired county worker named Greta Dahl, who minded her business and made very good coffee and did not ask questions about Mara's schedule. She read it and put her phone in her pocket and sat with it. 9 years was not everything. It was not the full weight of what had been done to the animals, to Day, to Mara, to everyone who had been in that facility's orbit and paid something they shouldn't have had to pay. Institutional justice almost never fully matched the weight of institutional harm. The gap between them was not nothing, it was real. You could know that the outcome was correct and still feel the distance between correct and complete. Not that distance. She also felt the 9 years. The permanent ban. The formal reclassification of her service record. The 4 corrected words on Rook's behavioral assessment changed from unreliable operational response to correct operational response, which were only 4 words, but were the 4 words that had structured 7 years of her life and which were now officially and permanently different. She felt all of it in the complicated way of a person who had not simplified the experience in order to carry it and was not going to start simplifying it now. Fall. Volta was cleared for placement. It had taken 8 months. Dr. Omen had been involved throughout, and Day had worked with her 3 times a week during the final stages. And Mara had been there for all of it, not always doing something, sometimes just present, which was its own form of doing something when the animal involved had spent a long period learning that presence meant harm. Volta went to a family in the agricultural district west of Dunmore. They had 3 acres and 1 child, who was 10 years old and very quiet, and had, according to her parents, always been better with animals than with people, which they said, without concern as a fact about who she was. Drove Volta out herself on a Saturday morning, with Day in the passenger seat and a kennel in the back of a borrowed truck. The girl met them at the gate of the property. She looked at Volta with an expression that was not excited in the loud way. Children were sometimes described as excited but focused, attentive. The way Mara recognized as the expression of someone who was actually seeing the animal in front of them, rather than projecting onto it. Volta stepped out of the kennel. She looked at the girl. She walked forward slowly, and the girl held her hand out, and open, and waited. Volta put her nose to the girl's hand. The girl looked up at Mara with the expression of someone who understood that something real had just happened. She's okay, said, not as a question. She's going to be, Mara said. On the drive back, Day was quiet for about 15 minutes, and then said, I keep thinking about Rex. No, Mara said. I'm not in a bad place about it, Day said, which was the kind of sentence people say when they are partially, but are also telling the truth. I just think about him. That's right, Mara said. That's the right thing to do. They drove back through Scrullendon that was going gold with the season. The flat land between Dunmore and the facility, catching the late morning light in a way that was, briefly, genuinely beautiful. The way unremarkable places sometimes are when the light decides to do something with them. Last thing Mara did on the day. She formally marked her 1-year anniversary at the facility. She did not plan for it to be the last thing. It simply was sit in the Eastern Kennel Building with Ghost at the end of the afternoon. He was 7 years older than optimal for retraining for active service, and the behavioral residue of his years at Greywall made active service unlikely regardless of age. He was not in the official language of the program deployable. He was something else, a facility resident, a working presence in the rehabilitation program, a dog whose specific history with Mara had made him useful in a way that the program documentation was still working out language for. She had not found that language yet either. She had tried a few versions and set them aside. What she knew was that when she brought new animals through the kennel building, animals that were frightened and defensive, and had learned that people meant pain, Ghost's presence was not neutral. He was calm in a way that communicated itself to other dogs. The low-frequency calm of an animal that had been afraid and had come through it and had found on the other side that it was possible to trust one specific person entirely and to let that trust be enough. The new animals looked at him. They looked at Mara. They calculated something in the way animals calculate, and what they seemed to calculate was that if this dog was calm here with this person, then calm was an available option. It was not a miracle. It was not even particularly dramatic. It was a dog being himself in a room and other dogs noticing. But it worked 6 times in the past year. Mara had brought a new animal into the building and watched it move from defensive to watchful, and then slowly from watchful toward something that might eventually become ease. And in every case, Ghost had been there doing nothing in particular, just present. She sat beside him in the late afternoon light that came through the kennel building's high windows, the yellow-gold light of early evening that made even concrete look warmer than it was, and she did not try to make it into a conclusion. It was just an evening. Just a dog, just a woman who had walked into a facility a year ago with a temporary badge and a contractor form, who had lowered herself to one knee in a stress pen because it was the right thing to do, and who was still here because being here was still the right thing to do. And she had gotten, over the years, fairly good at recognizing the difference between staying because you had to and staying because it mattered. She had been dismissed, and she had been investigated, and she had been walked to the exit and handed paperwork and told that she had exceeded her scope. She had been called nothing more than a nurse with a certification, as though a certification was a limitation rather than a floor. She had stayed anyway, not because she was fearless. She was not fearless, had never been, had simply gotten comfortable with the fact that useful things were often frightening, and that the fear was not a reason to stop, but a signal to pay better attention. Not because she had known walking in how it was going to end. She had not known, had only known that what she was seeing was wrong, and that she had both the training and the stubborn particularity to document it correctly. The outcome had not been smooth. It had not been fast. It had been a long, complicated, incrementally building sequence of choices made under pressure, most of which had looked in the moment like they might not be enough. They had been enough, not because she had been exceptional, because she had refused to be reduced to the version of herself that other people's contempt required. Because that was the thing nobody told you about this kind of fight, not the institutional kind, not the legal kind, but the fundamental kind. The one that starts the moment someone looks at you and decides you are not what you are. Fight is not one dramatic confrontation. It is 100 small moments of refusing to become what they see when they look at you. It is lowering yourself to one knee in a room full of people who have already decided what's going to happen. It is writing down the time in your notebook and taking the photograph and forwarding it to the right person. It is staying when they expect you to leave. Ghost stood up. He stretched the way dogs stretch with their whole body, the complete unself-conscious physicality of an animal who is comfortable enough to be entirely present in his body. He walked to the kennel door and looked at her. She stood up and opened it. He walked out beside her into the last of the evening light, and they went to do the end-of-day chess together, and the kennel building settled into its nighttime quiet behind them, and the facility perimeter lights came on one by one, and Mara Sutton, nurse medic handler, director, the woman they had put in a stress pen to break, and who had walked out with the dog beside her, went about her work without looking back.